Zero. That was the official number presented to the public. According to the solemn, sworn testimony of the nation's highest law enforcement officials, the Federal Bureau had found zero credible names. They had unearthed zero powerful accomplices. They had identified zero wealthy clients. The narrative was meticulously crafted and relentlessly pushed by every institutional megaphone. The story was aggressively simple. There was only the disgraced financier. There was only his primary enabler. They operated entirely alone in a vacuum of extraordinary wealth and influence. For years, the American public was force-fed this exact same, deeply sanitized narrative. There is no one else to charge. The massive, sprawling files are permanently closed. The investigation is completely, irreversibly over. It was a massive, impenetrable wall of institutional silence, built brick by brick, with redacted documents and evasive press releases. But yesterday, that wall did not just crack. It violently, publicly, and spectacularly shattered. It happened inside a remarkably quiet congressional chamber, a room fundamentally designed to maintain the status quo. The hidden files were physically brought into the unforgiving light of day. The heavily redacted names were finally read aloud for the permanent historical record. And a powerful, seemingly untouchable federal director was brutally forced into a 23-second silence. That specific silence was so heavy, so undeniable, that it permanently altered the political landscape of the Capitol. Who exactly were the untouchable, elite figures hiding on that list? And why were their identities so fiercely, desperately protected by the very justice system that was sworn to expose them? To truly understand the magnitude of what transpired, you have to understand the specific atmosphere of the room before the storm hit. 3 minutes before this catastrophic exchange occurred, the environment offered absolutely no warning. The air was thick with the usual suffocating boredom of bureaucratic oversight. There was no visible tension. There was no disruptive clamor in the hallways. There were no elevated voices echoing off the polished marble walls of the Legislative Committee chamber. It was merely mid-afternoon, on a standard, unremarkable Thursday. In the intricate choreography of Washington politics, Thursday afternoon is the graveyard shift. It is the precise time slot, engineered by the political establishment to gently, effectively drain public attention. It is the familiar, quiet window when broadcasted governmental footage typically transforms into ambient background noise. Across the country, empty administrative offices and distracted political aides barely glanced at the glowing screens. The committee's daily agenda consisted of standard, painfully dry budgetary line items. They discussed routine personnel inquiries with monotonous voices. They reviewed deeply technical procedural updates that meant nothing to the average citizen. It was the steady, unglamorous, mechanical grind of institutional oversight. Everything was moving along exactly as the capital city prefers. The gears of power were turning quietly in the dark. This particular session was fundamentally designed, from its very inception, to be entirely forgettable. Then, the appointed director walked into the grand chamber. He projected an aura of absolute, unshakable control. He carried himself like a man who had successfully survived profoundly worse environments and always emerged victorious. His shoulders were perfectly squared, pulling his suit jacket taut. His physical posture was meticulously rigid, a masterclass in nonverbal dominance. His tailored navy suit projected the quiet, exacting precision of someone who inherently understands the mechanics of power. He knew exactly how authority was supposed to look, sound, and feel in a high-stakes public setting. He was no amateur. He had previously endured intensely adversarial interrogations from hostile lawmakers. He had survived relentless, blistering media firestorms that would have ruined lesser men. He had successfully navigated well over 100 comparable legislative hearings. Each grueling experience had served a purpose. They solidified the most crucial survival tactic taught within the elite corridors of influence: The golden rules of the testimony table. Maintain absolute icy composure. Offer minimal, heavily filtered commentary. Concede absolutely nothing to your opposition, not even an inch of rhetorical ground. A trio of highly specialized, incredibly expensive legal counsels positioned themselves closely beside him. Their physical presence was intentionally subtle, yet unmistakably vigilant. They were the silent guardians of his narrative. Two senior strategic aides settled into the heavy leather chairs directly behind him. Their massive, color-coded reference binders were already neatly opened and meticulously tabbed. Everything about the official's demeanor suggested exhaustive, paranoid preparation. He radiated an unwavering, almost intimidating confidence. He possessed an absolute expectation of maintaining total narrative control over the room, and for a while, his confidence seemed entirely justified. The initial 90 minutes of the session unfolded exactly according to the anticipated, heavily rehearsed script. Committee members representing the opposing political faction delivered deeply predictable, fundamentally safe inquiries. They asked meandering questions about regional field office staffing shortages. They questioned internal organizational morale with feigned concern. They discussed the complex, boring strategic allocation of federal resources. These questions were transparently designed more to consume the allotted time on the clock than to extract any genuinely actionable intelligence. Meanwhile, members aligned with the investigating faction pressed firmly, but politely, on the progress of previous civic inquiries. They questioned complex internal accountability frameworks. They probed the boundaries of broader oversight mechanisms. In return for their efforts, they reliably received the exact same polished, carefully evasive responses the official had masterfully refined over his extensive career. He offered measured, polite nods. He gracefully acknowledged their theoretical concerns without ever validating them. He constantly, relentlessly emphasized his agency's strict adherence to internal protocol. Whenever tactically necessary, he expertly depleted the remaining time on the clock. He did this by launching into long, winding explanations of bureaucratic procedure. He executed this strategy perfectly, without ever appearing to actively avoid the core subject matter. It was a masterclass in running out the clock. At one specific juncture, he casually checked his expensive timepiece, signaling his mild impatience. At another, he methodically shifted his heavy briefing papers to demonstrate his focus. He occasionally lifted his glass of water, taking a sip with deliberate, unhurried calm. The man projected an aura of profound, untouchable boredom. That cultivated, practiced disinterest was precisely the strategic objective of the afternoon. If he was bored, the media would be bored. If the media was bored, the public would look away. But the procedural rhythm of the room shifted imperceptibly when a highly determined representative's name was finally called by the chairman. There was absolutely nothing theatrical in the manner the representative initiated his dialogue. There was no sudden, dramatic elevation in his vocal volume. There was no grandiose, sweeping rhetorical flourish to signal an attack. There was no visible bodily signal indicating that anything deviating from the boring norm was rapidly approaching. Addressing the director directly, the representative spoke in a tone that bordered on entirely casual. He stated clearly that he wished to take a few moments to discuss the broader concept of institutional transparency. The official offered a slight, highly practiced nod of acknowledgement. It was the reflexive, almost automatic gesture of a seasoned witness who genuinely believes he already fully comprehends the exact trajectory of the impending conversation. Naturally, the director felt entirely secure. Transparency is universally considered the safest, softest, most malleable buzzword within the entire political landscape. It is a brilliant, empty term. It simultaneously promises profound, sweeping revelation, while technically committing the speaker to absolutely nothing of substance. It is the ultimate political shield. The Bureau remains fully and unequivocally committed to operating with the utmost transparency. The official began to recite, his voice smooth and practiced. He meticulously added the standard, necessary caveat. He stated that such openness naturally always exists within the strict, legally mandated boundaries of established protocols. It was a perfect, meaningless answer, but the representative swiftly intercepted the predictable response before the director could finish his thought. The lawmaker offered a smile. It was a smile noticeably devoid of any genuine warmth or professional camaraderie. The expression was surgically precise. It was tightly, dangerously controlled. It was unmistakably prosecutorial in its fundamental nature. It was the specific, terrifying kind of smile utilized by an investigator who has already definitively verified the ultimate truth. He was not fishing for answers. He was currently merely setting the inevitable, inescapable logistical trap. The representative smoothly announced to the silent room that he possessed a collection of highly specific documents. He stated with quiet intensity that the general public fundamentally deserved the immediate right to review these materials. Reaching downward in a fluid, deliberate motion, he retrieved a remarkably thick, crimson-colored binder from beneath his desk. He lifted it with both hands and placed it firmly upon the polished wooden surface in front of him. The physical gesture was undeniably pronounced. It was visually striking and entirely impossible to ignore in the muted tones of the hearing room. The heavy crimson folder was meticulously organized. It was heavily tabbed with bright yellow adhesive markers sticking out from the edges. It was visibly dense enough to strongly suggest countless hours of exhaustive, obsessive preparation. It represented months of quietly, relentlessly overcoming entrenched institutional resistance. It was the precise category of evidentiary compilation that loudly announces its devastating purpose long before a single page is ever turned. It looked heavy. It looked dangerous. The director's facial expression did not immediately register a dramatic, cinematic shift. He was too well trained for that, but the high-definition broadcast lenses captured a significantly more nuanced involuntary physical reaction. Upon close, frame-by-frame examination of the visual record at that exact moment, one can clearly observe the official's fingers. They tightened significantly against the hard wooden edge of the witness table. It was a microscopic, almost invisible contraction of muscle. Yet, it was entirely sufficient to betray a sudden, sharp spike of internal awareness. His body knew he was in danger before his conscious mind fully accepted it. Maintaining an impeccably even, rigidly controlled vocal tone, the official assured the committee of his ongoing cooperation. He stated that he was perfectly willing to discuss any evidentiary materials whatsoever. However, he quickly added his protective condition. He would only discuss them provided they had been formally and appropriately cleared for public dissemination through the proper channels. The representative immediately severed the official's sentence, cutting him off mid-breath. He boldly, loudly declared that the materials in question had indeed been thoroughly, legally cleared. They were officially declassified as of the late hours of the previous evening. They were now firmly, irrevocably residing within the public domain. This operational status, the representative emphasized with piercing, undeniable clarity, granted him unrestricted, absolute legal authority. He could read the contents aloud. He could read them right in that very room. He could read them at that exact moment. He unequivocally noted, staring directly into the director's eyes, that there existed no institutional mechanism, no legal maneuver, and no political pressure capable of halting the imminent disclosure. He had the floor. He had the microphone. And he had the documents. The atmospheric pressure within the expansive, high-ceilinged room shifted instantly. It did not happen through a sudden eruption of noise. It did not happen through any grandiose physical movements from the gallery. It happened through a silent, unmistakable, and profound collective realization that spread like an electric current. Senior legislative members abruptly averted their attention from their glowing mobile devices. They leaned forward intently in their elevated, high-backed leather chairs. They needed to better observe the rapidly unfolding dynamic below them. Even the seasoned, cynical technicians operating the broadcast equipment instinctively reacted. They adjusted their focal lengths. They zoomed in with deliberate, mechanical precision, tightening the frame on the director's face. This is a technical maneuver that is exceedingly rare during typically monotonous, static procedural hearings. Every single individual present in the chamber implicitly, instinctively understood the gravity of the situation. An irreversible historical threshold was currently being crossed in real time. The representative methodically opened the heavy, stiff cover of the crimson folder. The sound of the thick paper turning echoed sharply in the sudden quiet. These are internal records directly related to the disgraced financier's investigation, he stated, his voice cutting clearly through the silence. He specifically detailed the nature of the evidence. He explained that the gathered materials meticulously documented the true identities of highly influential individuals. These were people who had frequently visited the figure's private, secluded properties. They were individuals who had repeatedly utilized his personal, private aviation transport. Their names prominently surfaced time and time again within sworn official witness testimonies. Locking his piercing gaze directly onto the official at the witness table, he asked a dangerously simple question. He inquired if the director was personally familiar with these particular archives. The official's jawline visibly tightened. The muscles bunched as he carefully, desperately formulated his response. He stated, retreating to bureaucratic safety, that his massive organization diligently maintains incredibly extensive evidentiary records. He noted that these files pertain to a vast multitude of highly complex, ongoing investigations across the globe. He attempted a standard, reliable pivot. He suggested that, without the opportunity to personally, physically review the specific pages currently in question, he could not possibly provide a definitive, accurate answer under oath. It was a classic delay tactic. The representative aggressively refused to allow the deflection to stand. He immediately pulled forth the very first sheet of paper from the crimson binder. "I am about to show you the specific context," he declared, holding the paper up. He identified the document for the record. It was a meticulously documented official visitor log. It originated directly from the controversial financier's heavily scrutinized coastal estate. It was explicitly, undeniably dated over 2 decades prior. With a steady, unyielding, almost rhythmic voice, he began to vocalize the names officially recorded on the manifest. The initial trio of individuals meant absolutely nothing to the broader listening public. They were obscure, anonymous figures, largely lost to the relentless, grinding passage of historical time. The fourth individual identified was a highly prominent financial manager. His peripheral, vague association with the disgraced figure had already been adequately reported in the press in previous years. There was nothing particularly explosive or legally revelatory about his presence on the list yet. And then, with deliberate, agonizing, perfectly timed pacing, the representative articulated the 5th name on the list. The resulting silence that cascaded over the massive room was instantaneous, absolute, and utterly terrifying. It was not the polite, respectful, attentive quiet of an engaged audience listening carefully to a complex presentation. Rather, it was the suffocating, heavy, oppressive kind of silence that spontaneously occurs in moments of profound, collective shock. It was the distinct sound of 50 highly connected individuals collectively and involuntarily suspending their own breathing. It was the sound of a paradigm shifting. Continuing his verbal offensive, the representative's vocal tone hardened significantly. All traces of conversational politeness vanished. He pointedly informed the director that this specific, highly recognizable, incredibly powerful name did not just appear once by coincidence. It materialized exactly 17 separate times within those very access logs. This frequency, occurred over a meticulously documented, highly condensed 6-month duration. 17 distinct, officially recorded, undeniable visits to the estate. He raised the physical page high into the air. He ensured the broadcast lenses could clearly capture the stark black ink on the white paper. He passionately, furiously questioned the official sitting before him. Why, he demanded to know, when the legislative body had formally requested these exact documents several years prior, were they fiercely withheld? Why were they purposefully, intentionally categorized as vastly too sensitive for public release? What exact threat to national security did this specific schedule of visits pose? The questions hung in the air, heavy with accusation. The director slowly extended his hand toward his water glass. It was a desperate attempt to buy time. While his broader physical movements remained relatively steady, the micro-expressions told a vastly different story. His hand trembled just slightly before gripping the glass. The prolonged, highly calculated pause preceding his verbal response telegraphed the massive, crushing gravity of his predicament. He finally spoke. He adopted a deeply serious, hushed, almost mournful tone. He softly explained that bureaucratic decisions regarding document classification are inherently legally complex. He argued that they involve immensely complicated internal, interagency considerations. These choices, he insisted, are intricately, inextricably tied to the protection of personal privacy rights. Furthermore, they are bound by the delicate, fragile integrity of ongoing, highly active criminal investigations. He spoke the words beautifully, but they were entirely hollow. The representative snapped back with immediate, devastating, predatory ferocity. He obliterated the director's defensive shield with a single, undeniable sentence. He boldly, loudly stated that there was fundamentally no ongoing investigation left to protect. The primary architect of the massive, illicit network was dead. His chief accomplice was permanently, securely, confined to a federal penitentiary for the rest of her natural life. There was no one left to investigate. There was no operation left to compromise. This deliberate, systemic obfuscation, the representative forcefully asserted, was not designed to protect the integrity of a righteous pursuit of justice. It was never about protecting sources or methods. Rather, it was an orchestrated, massive, systemic effort. It was a cover-up exclusively designed to shield deeply powerful and highly influential figures from enduring any form of public or legal accountability. It was the system protecting its own. Subsequently, the representative escalated the confrontation even further. The temperature in the room dropped. He extracted a second, noticeably thicker document from the binder. The paper made a sharp, crisp sound. It was printed upon heavier, official-grade paper. It bore an unmistakable, highly authoritative, institutional letterhead at the top. Speaking with slow, methodical, terrifying precision, he identified the new artifact. It was an authentic, officially verified aviation manifest. It detailed the exact passenger logs of the disgraced financier's infamous private aircraft. It bore a specific, undeniable date from the early 2000s. He paused deliberately. He allowed the heavy, historical weight of that specific date to fully settle into the consciousness of the room. He noted, looking down at the paper, that the listed passenger registry included exactly 4 distinct individuals on that particular flight. 3 of these identities had been incrementally, slowly introduced into the public sphere over the intervening years through various leaks and reporting. He paused once again. This time, he extended the silence longer. He expertly tightened the palpable, suffocating tension radiating throughout the chamber. The air felt thick enough to cut. The 4th and final name, he finally revealed, had been completely, surgically obscured. It was heavily, aggressively redacted with thick black ink in every single prior public dissemination of this specific archival record. The public had never been allowed to see it. Pivoting his body to directly face the sweating witness, he delivered the crushing, undeniable blow. He stated with devastating, crystalline clarity that the redaction had been explicitly, legally authorized under the director's own personal authority. He had signed off on the black ink, and this occurred merely 3 months after he had initially assumed command of the investigative bureau. The official slightly parted his lips in a desperate, panicked attempt to interject. He needed to stop the momentum. But the representative instantly raised an authoritative, open hand. He commanded the floor and aggressively signaled that his evidentiary presentation was far from concluded. He was just getting started. He relentlessly continued his verbal assault, his voice rising in power. He revealed that this intentionally, desperately shielded identity did not just appear on one isolated flight. It consistently appeared on exactly 12 separate, highly detailed, officially logged flight manifests. These documents recorded multiple, extended journeys to various opulent estates and highly secluded private islands. The representative maintained an unwavering, predatory, unblinking gaze upon the official. At the same time, the broadcast cameras tightly framed the director's increasingly strained, pale facial features. Behind the official's carefully maintained, expensive visual exterior, one could clearly observe the frantic, desperate flickering of internal calculation. It was a violent psychological battle playing out in his eyes. Reflexive, instinctual denial was rapidly competing with desperate, strategic deflection. His foundational defense strategy, built over decades, was visibly, publicly collapsing in real time. The representative powerfully proclaimed that the restrictive, protective redaction had been formally, legally dissolved. This occurred during a comprehensive, unavoidable declassification review late the previous night. This fundamental shift in legal status meant that, for the very first time in history, the American populace finally possessed the truth. They had the unencumbered, legal ability to see exactly who had been occupying those specific, highly controversial flights. There was nowhere left to hide. He aggressively angled the heavy document toward the media gallery. He ensured that even on standard-definition television monitors across the country, the authorizing signature at the very bottom of the page was undeniably, painfully visible. It was the director's signature. Within a matter of seconds, the digital landscape of social media began to violently, uncontrollably erupt. The previously concealed, highly protected name began algorithmically trending worldwide at an unprecedented speed. This massive digital explosion happened before the representative even had the opportunity to physically vocalize the name within the chamber. The director's primary, highly paid legal counsel leaned forward with intense, visible, frantic urgency. He desperately whispered strategic advice directly into his client's ear, likely advising him to invoke his right to remain silent. But the official merely offered a subtle, deeply dismissive, defeated shake of his head. He knew it was too late. Re-engaging the desktop microphone, the official's voice had grown noticeably, pathetically quieter. He sounded significantly more cautious, deeply defensive, and entirely stripped of his previous arrogance. He attempted a weak, desperate argument. He claimed that reviewing decades-old, historical aviation manifests is inherently, analytically, dangerous. Doing so, he argued, without the benefit of proper, comprehensive contextual framing, could easily lead to wildly inaccurate, damaging public assumptions. It was a plea for nuance in a room that demanded facts. The representative forcefully, violently interrupted the pathetic, bureaucratic rationalization. He volunteered to provide the exact requested context without a single moment of hesitation. He was ready for the pivot. He withdrew yet another piece of paper from the seemingly endless depths of the crimson binder. He held it up. He identified the new material as a sworn, legally binding investigative testimony. It was provided under oath by a former domestic employee. She had served at the disgraced financier's primary, heavily fortified urban residence during the early 2000s. Her official recorded statement was formally documented by federal agents nearly a decade later. It explicitly, vividly described repeatedly observing the exact same highly influential, heavily protected individual lingering within the dark property. Reading verbatim from the official transcribed record, the representative quoted the witness directly. Her words were simple, clear, and utterly devastating. She stated that the prominent figure was present on at least 5 or 6 distinct, separate occasions that she had personally, visually witnessed. She noted a pattern. He consistently arrived during the late evening hours. He was always in the direct, exclusive, private company of the primary offender. They interacted in a deeply relaxed manner that heavily suggested a long-standing, deeply familiar, and highly secretive friendship. An audible collective gasp rippled through the packed gallery seating. This was not a metaphorical embellishment used by writers for dramatic effect. It was a literal, physical, collective intake of breath. It represented the terrifying, undeniable sound of dozens of cynical, professional political observers simultaneously realizing the absolute magnitude of the moment. They were actively, presently witnessing a massive institutional unraveling that could absolutely never be undone, no matter how much spin was applied later. Placing the heavy transcript firmly back onto the desk, the representative demanded real answers. He leaned forward, his eyes burning into the director. He wanted to know exactly why such pivotal, highly corroborative, explosive testimony had been intentionally entombed. Why had it sat gathering dust within the Bureau's highly restricted, locked archives for over a decade and a half? Why had it been so heavily, desperately shielded from any form of public release or basic legislative scrutiny? Who made the call to bury it? The official instinctively, reflexively initiated a defensive response. However, he abruptly caught himself mid-articulation. His brain short-circuited under the pressure. He accidentally addressed the representative by an entirely incorrect legislative title, before hastily, nervously, and clumsily correcting his phrasing. The verbal slip was objectively, linguistically minor in isolation. People misspeak all the time. But within the hyper-scrutinized, intensely predatory, high-stakes environment of that specific room, it functioned as a fatal, undeniable tell. It was a massive drop of blood in shark-infested waters. The awkward, stumbling, panicked correction hung suspended in the highly charged air. It resonated significantly longer and vastly louder than any direct shouted accusation ever could. The official's momentary lapse exposed a profound truth. It exposed not a lack of basic intelligence or preparation, but rather the immense, crushing, physical weight of mounting internal pressure. It was the specific, unavoidable physical manifestation of extreme psychological strain. This terror inevitably builds when a highly polished, deeply experienced witness abruptly realizes their carefully rehearsed, heavily vetted script has been completely, permanently incinerated. They are flying blind without a net. For 16 long, silent years, that explosive, damning testimony had rested quietly inside locked, steel filing cabinets. It remained entirely untouched by investigators. It was completely unseen by the voting public. It was fiercely, aggressively unchallenged by any governing body or oversight committee. Now, those 16 years of dark, complicit institutional silence suddenly and forcefully demanded a coherent, highly public, legally sound explanation. Attempting to aggressively reset his physical posture and project some semblance of renewed authority, the official carefully stated a new defense. He claimed, his voice trembling slightly, that the organization emphatically, categorically, does not utilize classification protocols for the purpose of shielding specific individuals. They do not hide documents, he insisted, to prevent public embarrassment or legal jeopardy for the elite political class. He passionately argued that such protective, secretive mechanisms exist exclusively to safeguard highly sensitive, fragile intelligence-gathering methodologies and the lives of undercover assets. The representative immediately pierced the flimsy textbook defense. His tone was now completely stripped of any remaining polite, collegial legislative pretense. The gloves were entirely off. He asserted with absolute, chilling confidence that the applied protocols undeniably, successfully succeeded in protecting this specific, highly powerful individual from ruin. He noted darkly, lowering his voice, that both men sitting in the room clearly, intimately understood the true, corrupt, underlying motivation. The dynamic shift within the chamber was stark, absolute, and unmistakable. This proceeding had fundamentally, permanently ceased being a routine, boring exercise in theatrical political oversight. It had rapidly, violently evolved into a direct, unvarnished, historical confrontation concerning massive, systemic institutional corruption. Refusing to allow the crushing, suffocating tension to dissipate for even a fraction of a second, the representative kept pushing. He reached back into the depths of the heavy crimson folder. He extracted another heavily classified document. He followed it rapidly with another, then another. He systematically, rhythmically stacked them in a deliberate, highly visible, geometric arrangement in front of the witness table. He was operating exactly like a seasoned, ruthless, cold-blooded prosecutor, methodically laying out a damning, inescapable chain of physical evidence before a captivated, horrified jury. Each individual piece of paper represented a distinct, calculated administrative decision to hide the truth. It represented a deliberate, intentional bureaucratic delay. It represented a formal, written denial of access. It highlighted a specific, documented chronological moment where required, legal public disclosure had been actively, maliciously, and successfully thwarted by the agency. The representative clearly, chronologically established the historical timeline of the cover-up. He proved, waiving the denial letters, that the Legislative Committee had formally, repeatedly requested these exact files multiple years prior. On every single occasion, without fail, the requests were flatly, aggressively denied by the Bureau. They always used the exact same impenetrable, blanket, unchallengeable justification. National Security Classification. The director remained perfectly still, frozen like a statue. He listened to the unfolding public indictment without attempting to interrupt again. His facial expression remained tightly controlled, a mask of stone. Yet, it was entirely, visibly devoid of its previous aura of untouchable, arrogant confidence. The armor was gone. His respiratory pattern had visibly, drastically altered. He was no longer breathing normally. He was now taking subtle, shallow, rapid, measured inhalations. These short breaths were explicitly, biologically designed to mechanically maintain physical composure and prevent hyperventilation under the weight of excruciating, unbearable public pressure. The representative relentlessly continued his verbal assault, offering no quarter. He highlighted a devastating fact. He noted that at absolutely no point during the official's entire, lengthy tenure leading the agency had the truth ever been told to the committee. The massive bureau had never once, in all those years, informed the Oversight Committee that any active, ongoing, legitimate investigation regarding these specific, named individuals was actually taking place. He allowed the profound, heavy, undeniable weight of that factual statement to fully land on the audience. It echoed in the silence. He noted that, despite the total, complete absence of any active criminal pursuit to protect, the heavy, dark veil of classification resolutely, stubbornly remained firmly in place. It was secrecy for the sake of protection, not justice. Adjusting his seated position, the official desperately attempted a highly technical, deeply convoluted, deeply legalistic rebuttal. He argued, citing vague statutes, that the mere absence of a currently active criminal prosecution does not automatically, legally justify full disclosure. It does not legally permit the reckless, unilateral, massive release of deeply sensitive raw materials Such a careless action, he theorized, could potentially inflict devastating, irreversible impacts upon individual privacy rights and constitutional protections. Furthermore, it could severely, irreparably damage broader, unnamed national security interests. The representative immediately shot back, his voice cracking like a whip. He dismissed the weak, overly lawyered defense with absolute, unfiltered contempt. He noted that while such a carefully focus-grouped, heavily sanitized answer might comfortably survive a chaotic, brief White House press briefing, it was entirely useless here. It was completely insufficient and utterly, legally unacceptable within the walls of a sworn, formal, investigative congressional hearing. He demanded facts, not PR spin. Leaning his upper body significantly forward, closing the physical distance, his vocal delivery dropped into a lower, far more deliberate, menacing register. He stated that theoretical, abstract privacy concerns absolutely do not justify massive, systemic, coordinated cover-ups. They do not justify systematically, repeatedly redacting the exact same, highly recognizable, incredibly powerful name across entirely distinct, separate categories of evidence. You cannot legally hide a name from aviation logs, estate visitor registries, sworn witness depositions, and visual photographic records simply to protect someone's privacy from public embarrassment. Reaching once more into the seemingly bottomless, terrifying crimson folder, the representative produced a new piece of highly visual evidence. It was a stark, glossy, full-color photograph. It was a high-resolution print professionally, carefully mounted on thick, rigid cardstock to prevent it from bending. He elevated the image slowly, deliberately. He ensured the massive array of broadcast cameras possessed ample time to properly focus their lenses. They needed to clearly, sharply transmit the visual to the waiting, watching, increasingly horrified public. He accurately, clearly identified the specific, luxurious location and the exact year the image was captured. He noted that this specific, single photograph had actually already resided within the public domain for numerous years. It was widely recognized, endlessly analyzed by virtually everyone present in the chamber. The picture clearly, undeniably depicted exactly what the general public already inherently understood to be true about the elite class. It showed two highly influential, immensely powerful men standing incredibly close together. They were smiling warmly, genuinely. Their arms were draped casually, affectionately, around each other's shoulders. They radiated a deeply relaxed, highly familiar, and unmistakably, undeniably friendly dynamic. They looked like partners. However, the representative's physical movements clearly indicated he was far from finished with his devastating visual presentation. Declaring loudly that he was now going to reveal what the public had been deliberately, maliciously prevented from seeing for decades, he produced more evidence. He brought out a thick, heavy secondary stack of heavily guarded, previously unseen photographs. He methodically, loudly flipped through the glossy images one by one. The sound of the thick photo paper snapping echoed in the room. He explicitly detailed the numbers. He stated that he possessed 32 completely unreleased, highly classified photographs. They all originated from that exact same, exclusive, highly private elite social gathering. 32 high-resolution images that had been quietly, secretly languishing within the Bureau's secure, climate-controlled, highly restricted evidence vaults. 32 distinct, undeniable visual records that the director himself had personally, repeatedly, and aggressively refused to clear for public dissemination, citing vague privacy concerns. Beneath the intense, unforgiving, blinding glare of the high-wattage hearing room lighting, the official's forehead began to noticeably, heavily glisten. This was not a flowery, metaphorical description of political pressure. It was a highly visible, undeniable, biological, physical manifestation of profound, overwhelming, terrifying stress. The heavy sheen of sweat clearly, constantly caught the ambient light every single time he slightly shifted his panicked gaze. His lead attorney hastily slid a folded, handwritten, desperate note across the polished wooden table, but the official merely cast a brief, completely distracted, uncomprehending glance at the paper before quickly pushing it away. He was beyond the help of lawyers now. Straining desperately, visibly to maintain any semblance of vocal stability, the director weakly argued his increasingly fragile position. He claimed that the mass, unfiltered release of such highly sensitive, raw investigatory photographs legally necessitates an incredibly careful, prolonged process. It requires an exhaustive, multi-layered internal review process to entirely, absolutely ensure that the agency does not inadvertently, accidentally compromise critical, ongoing operational integrity. The representative violently, physically interrupted the pathetic, transparent stalling tactic. He slammed his open palm fiercely, with all his might, onto the hard wooden surface of the desk. The sheer physical force of the sudden, violent impact caused the highly sensitive desktop microphone to violently jump. It sent a sharp, loud, deafening percussive echo, instantly ricocheting throughout the cavernous marble chamber. He aggressively, furiously reiterated the core, undeniable truth of the entire situation. The primary architect of the massive criminal enterprise was dead. He was buried in the ground. His partner was firmly, securely locked inside a maximum security prison cell for the rest of her life. He forcefully, loudly screamed that there were absolutely no active prosecutions left in existence for the Bureau to theoretically, hypothetically compromise. The raw, unfiltered, deeply human emotional force of the brutal confrontation sent visible, undeniable shockwaves rippling through the previously sedate, boring room. Junior legislative staffers began whispering urgently, almost frantically, into the ears of their stunned superiors. Seasoned, cynical political reporters in the gallery frantically reached for their glowing mobile devices. They needed to instantly, urgently broadcast the rapidly escalating historical crisis to their news desks. Several senior, incredibly powerful senators occupying the elevated platform exchanged deeply uneasy, terrified, wide-eyed glances. These looks betrayed profound institutional discomfort, deep fear, rather than genuine surprise. They knew exactly what was happening, and they knew how dangerous it was to the system they controlled. In an unprecedented, highly shocking breach of standard committee decorum, the representative physically stood up from his heavy leather chair. In countless decades of observing and documenting high-level congressional inquiries, such a physical, aggressive escalation during a questioning period was virtually unheard of. While parliamentary rules do not explicitly, legally forbid the physical action, the deeply ingrained, unspoken cultural traditions of the institution practically demand it. Interrogators are expected to remain seated, polite, and restrained. Standing violently shatters the carefully maintained, deeply necessary illusion of polite, orderly, civilized procedure. It breaks the unspoken, sacred gentleman's agreement that governmental power will forever remain physically restrained and emotionally detached. The representative, however, clearly did not care about preserving any institutional polite fiction today. He was burning the house down. Towering aggressively, physically over the wooden desk, he locked his intense, furious eyes onto the sweating official. He announced his immediate, unyielding intention to deliver a remarkably direct, brutally uncompromising question. He aggressively demanded a simple, binary, single-word response. He wanted either a yes or a no, nothing else. He sharply challenged the terrified official's basic ability to comply with the simple, direct request. The director offered a slow, incredibly heavy, defeated nod of assent. However, his wide, panicked eyes betrayed an overwhelming, crushing sense of impending, inescapable dread. The representative then, forcefully, slowly, asked the ultimate, devastating question. It was the question the entire country had been waiting years to hear, asked under oath. Had the massive federal bureau, operating under this specific official's direct, personal, and absolute leadership, ever conducted any form of active, legitimate, serious investigation into the highly powerful individuals clearly, undeniably named within these concealed evidentiary documents? The profound, crushing, suffocating silence that instantly followed the inquiry was absolute and entirely, terrifyingly consuming. This was not the standard, theatrical, rehearsed pause commonly utilized by ambitious politicians for dramatic, camera-ready emphasis. Rather, it was a terrifying, suffocating, absolute vacuum of sound. It seemed to physically, forcefully pull all the oxygen directly from the massive, crowded room. Exactly 23 agonizing, excruciating, endlessly long seconds slowly ticked by on the clock. In the highly accelerated, hyperverbal, constantly moving arena of a broadcasted congressional hearing, 23 seconds of absolute dead air represents an absolute eternity. It is a lifetime. The official cast his eyes downward, staring blankly toward his meticulously prepared, entirely useless, incredibly expensive briefing binders. He found no answers there. He then turned his gaze desperately, pleadingly toward his highly paid, elite, brilliant legal team. They offered him absolutely nothing in return. They were completely, utterly paralyzed by the brilliance and brutality of the trap. He glanced backward, seeking any friendly face, toward his senior strategic aides. He only found them staring fixedly, intensely, and highly uncomfortably down at their own laps, refusing to make eye contact. In a room literally overflowing with powerful political allies, incredibly expensive defense lawyers, and highly connected elites, the official was entirely, fundamentally, and utterly alone. He was on an island, and the tide was rapidly rising. Finally breaking the suffocating, unbearable, heavy tension, the official's voice emerged. It was barely more than a strained, raspy, defeated whisper. He, mechanically, automatically recited standard, heavily vetted agency talking points. He claimed, his voice devoid of conviction, that the Bureau consistently, relentlessly pursues all highly credible, verifiable investigative leads. He stated, this is always done in strict, unwavering accordance with deeply established internal priorities and highly complex, legally mandated resource allocation frameworks. It was a non-answer, a pathetic retreat into bureaucratic jargon. The representative let out a sharp, deeply derisive, incredibly loud laugh. It contained absolutely no genuine humor whatsoever. It was instead pure, concentrated, weaponized disbelief aimed directly at the official's head. He mercilessly, brutally mocked the official's highly rehearsed response. He stated that the deeply convoluted, 73-word, meaningless bureaucratic word salad was ultimately just a coward's way of saying no. They had done nothing. They had investigated nothing. He began to deliberately, loudly, gather his scattered documents from the desk. He physically, undeniably signaled to the silent room that the designated phase of active, fact-finding questioning had definitively ended. The terrifying, historical phase of permanent, inescapable public judgment had officially commenced. With devastating, crystal clarity, the representative began to summarize the catastrophic, deeply corrupt scene he was currently observing. He described a massive, vastly powerful federal investigative agency with entirely broken, entirely corrupt priorities. They seemingly dedicated vastly more organizational energy, time, and manpower toward aggressively monitoring frustrated, ordinary parents at local school board meetings. They spent vastly more taxpayer resources on petty, domestic political surveillance than they had ever spent legitimately, seriously investigating the deeply influential, highly elite clientele of a globally recognized, convicted, and prolific abuser. He painted a damning, unforgettable, historically significant portrait of an institution rotting deeply from the inside out. They ruthlessly, seamlessly weaponized vital national security classifications solely to shield massively powerful political figures from facing any public scrutiny or legal consequences. They had entirely, completely abandoned their sacred, foundational constitutional mandate to protect the actual physical and moral security of the nation. They were protectors of the elite, not the people. He pointedly, aggressively described a director whose entire, highly decorated career was fundamentally built on moral compromise. He noted that the director had been personally, directly appointed to his incredibly high office by one of the exact men prominently, undeniably named within the hidden files. He explicitly, loudly suggested that the official fundamentally owed his entire professional trajectory to that dark relationship. His current, immense authority belonged entirely to that specific, heavily protected, deeply compromised figure. He was a captured regulator. Finally, he leveled the ultimate, inescapable accusation. He accused the official of spending the previous 11 months actively, intentionally, and maliciously burying vital, heavily corroborative evidence. This highly classified, hidden evidence directly connected his political benefactor to a globally disgraced, massive criminal enterprise. The Grand Chamber completely, violently erupted. It was not in celebratory applause or chaotic, aggressive, angry shouting. It was in an overwhelming, unstoppable tidal wave of frantic, deeply uncoordinated physical movement. Every single mobile device in the massive room materialized instantly, glowing in the dim light. High-level staffers frantically rushed toward the heavy, brass-handled wooden exit doors. They needed to urgently, desperately, brief their respective leadership networks on the absolute magnitude of the disaster. The presiding senior senator desperately, repeatedly hammered his heavy wooden gavel against the block. His frustrated, aging voice repeatedly called for the immediate restoration of parliamentary order. Yet his weak, heavily ignored commands barely managed to cut through the rapidly escalating, terrified din of the chaotic room. Another veteran senator appeared entirely, utterly stunned. His facial expression was permanently frozen in a deeply uncomfortable, highly revealing space. It was caught somewhere between genuine moral concern and frantic, cold, deeply cynical political calculation. Amidst the swirling, terrifying, historical chaos, the official remained firmly, rigidly glued to his seat. He was entirely motionless. His carefully constructed, highly expensive mask of untouchable institutional authority had finally, permanently shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. However, the relentless representative was still not entirely finished destroying the carefully constructed narrative. Elevating his powerful voice to effortlessly cut through the rising clamor, he held up a final piece of devastating evidence. It was a single, pristine, highly official sheet of paper held high above his head for all to see. He boldly, loudly declared that this specific document held vastly more destructive legal weight than absolutely everything else he had previously presented. He identified the paper as a highly restricted, deeply classified internal directive. It originated directly from the absolute upper echelons of the Justice Department. It was specifically, undeniably dated mere months after the director had initially assumed absolute, unquestioned control of the agency. Reading the heavily bureaucratic text aloud for the permanent historical record, he revealed a terrifying, inescapable truth. A specialized, highly secretive classification review board had been explicitly and urgently directed to conduct a highly expedited, deeply unusual review. They were ordered to perform a deeply comprehensive, massive sweep of any and all evidentiary materials connected to the disgraced financier. They were specifically hunting for documents that contained identifiable, specific references to any current or previously serving high-level government officials. Lowering the paper slowly, letting the gravity settle, the representative stared straight through the completely broken official. He noted with surgical, terrifying precision that the devastating, highly illegal directive was physically signed by a specific individual. It bore the unmistakable signature of the director's own hand-picked, heavily trusted immediate deputy. He demanded to know the ultimate, final truth. Did the official sitting before him personally authorize the creation and execution of that specific, highly illegal memo? The official's mouth reflexively opened and closed, in a silent, deeply panicked, fish-like rhythm. He weakly, pathetically stammered that he could not immediately recall the specific operational details of that particular minor administrative action. The representative seized upon the pathetic, transparent evasion instantly. He slowly and mockingly repeated the exact, ridiculous phrase. He loudly questioned how a powerful, highly intelligent federal director could possibly fail to remember such a monumental, sweeping action. How do you forget personally ordering the massive, systemic reclassification of highly sensitive legal documents, especially when those actions were specifically designed to protect the highly influential friends of the very man who had appointed him to power? Elevating the damning piece of paper even higher for the flashing, relentless media cameras, the representative outlined the catastrophic results of that specific, illegal directive. Exactly 23 distinct pieces of critical, highly corroborative evidentiary documentation had been successfully pulled back into the dark shadows. They were officially reclassified and buried deep in the vaults. 23 separate files that had previously navigated the complex bureaucracy were suppressed. They had been fully cleared for imminent public release, only to be suddenly and violently hidden from the world. And, as the representative hammered home with unyielding, brutal mathematical force, every single one of those 23 suppressed documents shared a common, terrifying trait. They contained direct, unmistakable, highly specific references to the exact same heavily shielded name. It was the identical name discovered on the private aviation logs. It was the identical name featured within the sworn, horrific witness depositions. It was the identical name smiling warmly within the extensive photographic evidence that the agency aggressively refused to release. This, the representative thundered with absolute, unshakable conviction, was mathematically impossible to categorize as a mere bureaucratic coincidence. It was the literal, legal definition of intentional, systemic obstruction of justice. It was a highly orchestrated, massive institutional cover-up happening in broad daylight. It was perpetrated by a man currently sitting under the binding, highly serious legal constraints of a sworn congressional oath. In a final, desperately pathetic, entirely useless attempt to reclaim any tiny shred of his shattered dignity, the official weakly protested. He attempted to categorically and utterly reject any lingering, devastating implication of wrongdoing. He denied that his esteemed, massive agency had ever acted improperly, unethically, or with any underlying partisan or political motivation. He weakly, foolishly attempted to invoke the massive institution's historical, heavily tarnished commitment to the blind pursuit of justice. The representative aggressively, permanently severed the sentence for the final time. He delivered a crushing, absolutely undeniable verbal blow that ended the confrontation. He loudly declared that the official's only true, unwavering commitment was to one entity. It was to the extraordinarily powerful, highly connected man who had originally appointed him to his lofty position. His true commitment, the representative asserted, was entirely dedicated to fiercely protecting an entrenched, elite power structure. It was a structure that fundamentally exists only to perpetually protect itself from the consequences of its own deeply corrupt actions. His ultimate loyalty, the representative concluded with absolute, terrifying, historical finality, was entirely focused upon aggressively ensuring one thing. He wanted to ensure that certain highly privileged elite individuals would absolutely never be forced to face the terrifying reality of legal or social consequences.